Welcome to Exploring the Question, brought to you by the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. I'm your host, Gleaves Whitney, Executive Director of the Foundation. In today's episode, I think we're going to tackle a problem because of all the chaos surrounding the U.S. surrender of Afghanistan. There's serious questions. What happened to lead to such a catastrophic withdrawal of U.S. citizens and our Afghan friends? And let's remember our military as well. They're not out of the woods yet. And what's next? To explore these questions, I am joined by Joseph Hogan, who is the producer at Retro Report and director of fact-checking. He, in other words, he wouldn't say this, but he's the czar of truth. So we like to have friends like Joe. And we're going to explore a number of facets of this incredibly tragic turn of events in Afghanistan. Thank you for joining me, Joe.
Gleaves, thank you very much. I think I told you the other day when we were talking about this that I've long dreamed of getting the Gleaves Whitney interview treatment. So I'm very excited. It's finally happening.
Well, you'll find it very convivial.
Yes.
Because I know you know a lot of interesting things, and my object is to make sure that we bring out the best of your knowledge and insights.
Right.
Let's start with something really basic. How did you get involved in this remarkable film?
I started to be interested in doing a short documentary or a piece on the war in Afghanistan. I would say around the time that former President Trump, announced his intention to withdraw U.S. troops and do a deal, so to speak, with the Taliban. And when President Trump announced his intention on ending it, and when it became clear that President Biden was going to follow through with that intention, despite all of the apparent differences in his policies and President Trump's and all other aspects of American politics, I think I realized that I wanted to try to tell the story of the war from beginning to end, rather than focus on, like other documentaries and pieces had done, certain aspects of the war, because it had gone on for so long. People had focused on 2010 to 2012, say, and the major Obama surge in the war in Afghanistan, or the beginning of the war in Afghanistan and the hunt for bin Laden. I wanted to tell the whole story, try to understand how this war lasted so long, what its costs were, and how America and Afghanistan had changed over the 20 years that it was going on.
Joe, why was it a 20-year-long war? It's been called America's longest war. That's not quite accurate historically. Our wars against the Native Americans lasted a century, but in modern times, it's our 20-year war. Why did it go on that long?
I interviewed a number of former U.S. officials who were participants to some degree in the war from beginning to end. I interviewed Michael Morrell, who was for a time acting director of the CIA, but on 9/11 was President Bush's intelligence briefer, and was the one who had to tell him that he believed, that is, tell President Bush that he believed it was Al-Qaeda who attacked us. I interviewed him. I interviewed Richard Boucher, who was Assistant Secretary of State under President Bush and who oversaw Afghan policy, as well as policy toward Pakistan. And I interviewed Jeffrey Eggers, who was he was on President Obama's National Security Council and oversaw aspects of counterterrorism for President Obama. And all of them, I think now, or if they've said things to this effect, that, and President Biden says this, the initial aim in going into Afghanistan right after 9/11 was to topple the Taliban, because the Taliban were giving safe haven to Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. And Al-Qaeda were the perpetrators of 9/11. And once the US, that is, accomplished that goal of toppling the Taliban and driving Al-Qaeda out, our initial aims were fulfilled. We succeeded. And this happened by the end of 2001. It took a matter of weeks or a few short months, basically, to accomplish our initial goals. The war lasted 19 more years or 20 more years because the mission shifted from simply driving Al-Qaeda out and attempting to capture or kill bin Laden. They failed at that, though they did drive him out of Afghanistan and into Pakistan. The aim shifted to basically build Afghanistan into a stable democracy, sort of Western style. The hope was to make Kabul into a kind of Washington, D.C., to install and prop up, essentially, and support a leader, initially Karzai, who would run the country in a similar way that Western democracies are run, where there's a great deal of central control over the outer areas, provinces, towns, villages. And the aim was also to build up an Afghan army that could protect that government from the Taliban. And the aim or the hope in doing all of these things was to make sure that Afghanistan would never again be a safe haven for Al-Qaeda or any other terrorist organization. And the hope in doing that was that there would never again be another 9/11. There would never again be another major attack against the US started in or begun in or planned in Afghanistan. And that effort to build a stable democracy in Afghanistan took 20 years. And we've seen the result of the failure of that just recently, which was that once the US left, the Afghan army, which the US spent something like 85, 90 billion dollars to train and equip, was quickly toppled. And the government that the US spent so much money to prop up also failed, and President Ghani fled. So the effort to build Afghanistan into a stable democracy was what made the war so long. And that effort, I think most officials would now say, was a failure.
Joe, is the Afghan war just a variation on the theme of the Vietnam War, or is it really quite different? And really, in what sense is the war in Afghanistan different from the other wars in US history?
Well, I've talked with veterans who feel. One veteran I interviewed for the documentary, his name is Timothy Kudo. He was a former Marine captain who participated in, well, he was first in Iraq in 2009, but then during Obama's surge was moved to Afghanistan, to Helmand province, which is a very violent, particularly difficult area in Afghanistan to fight in. And he said that, to a degree, he does feel that he was in his generation's Vietnam. There are particular reasons for that. I think I won't speak for him, but an obvious difference is casualty count. There were nowhere near the amount of deaths in Afghanistan among US service members that there was in Vietnam. Very consciously, President Obama, when he increased troop levels in Afghanistan in 2009, 2010, did not want to repeat the Vietnam mistake. And one of the ways in which he tried to prevent the troop surge from becoming the next Vietnam in terms of casualty rate is by setting a deadline for the surge itself. So he didn't want to get the United States into a quagmire in Afghanistan in the manner that presidents had done in Vietnam. Nevertheless, the way in which these two wars are similar, I think, and a lot of people, I think, feel this way, is that they were, in the end, quagmires of a slightly different kind. And they were, in effect, attempts to change the culture of a place and to intervene in what might be called a civil war or a civil fight within a country. Richard Boucher said that, again, he was the former Assistant Secretary of State, said that one of the lessons he thought he learned and other US officials learned after Vietnam was that you can't win if you're fighting people for their own villages and their own territory. And you can't win when you're trying to change the fundamental nature of a country or intervene in a country's fight for its own identity and self-definition. And in those ways, I think the wars could arguably be called similar. And finally, I think they're similar in that they were both, in the end, largely failures, and that the US didn't achieve what it ended up trying to achieve. And in this way, I think a lot of veterans feel that the war was fought in vain and their sacrifices were made in vain, and their friends died and their comrades died in vain, and civilians died in vain.
Absolutely right. We never calculate as Americans the total cost of our wars, the moral injury, the inability of a lot of our veterans, through no fault of their own, but the inability to reintegrate into American society. I've often analogized these long wars of ours, these endless wars, and the human cost of them. I analogize it with the Odyssey, Homer's The Odyssey, and the Iliad. I mean, the Iliad, we have a approximately 9-10 year war, and then it takes Odysseus in the Odyssey 9-10 years to get back home. And that's symbolic of our veterans who may physically come back home, but before they really reintegrate, they go through a lot of tribulations, drug abuse, and many of the things actually that Homer explored, 2,500 years ago, 2,700 years ago.
Right.
So this war is interesting in that I think the American public lost sight of it at times. It just sort of went into the background. And as a result, we don't have, as a country, a nuanced understanding of the war in Afghanistan. For example, I think very few of us could talk about turning points, but there's one turning point I'm really interested in what you gleaned from your interviews, Joe, and what you set out in your documentary. When did we start to lose? When did we start to lose this war?
Yeah, well, I love what you say. Well, I agree with what you say, or what you said at the beginning, about Americans losing sight of the war. One thing I should have mentioned when I was talking about my initial interest is that this war was being fought over the majority of my life, and yet it would be very difficult for me to think back on times where I was hearing about the war actually being fought, which struck me as very strange, that we would be in a war and I as a citizen wouldn't really be hearing about it unless I was seeking it out, seeking the information out. The difficulty in talking about turning points in the war in Afghanistan, or one of the difficulties, and this is something that Richard Boucher mentioned to me, and he talks about it in our documentary, is that especially after 2001, when the government was just being formed in Afghanistan, things, as Boucher said, or says in the documentary, were sort of humming along. There were vaccinations set up, as he says. Elections were starting, and girls were going to school. And so things were looking good, particularly in Kabul. But the Taliban, they weren't defeated, they just sort of ran away. And there were certain areas in Afghanistan, in the outer regions, basically, and in the south, I think in particular, where they basically just regrouped. And one would often hear of fighting, in the outer reaches of the country, that was just sort of at a dull hum. But then by 2006, the Taliban had made a significant resurgence. And the US realized, and US officials realized, that this war was by no means over. And this was also a time when the US was fighting another war by then in Iraq. And a great deal of attention on the part of the Bush administration and military officials, and indeed the country and citizens, a lot of their attention was on the war in Iraq. And basically it was as if things, I think to most Americans, it was as if things in Afghanistan were sort of happening in the background, and many people might not have realized that the Taliban were resurgent by 2006, and that the war wasn't over, and that was going to be very hard. President Obama, when he took office, he ran in part on the view and on the platform that the war in Iraq was the so-called bad war. We were misled into it. It was a folly, and that the war in Afghanistan was a good war, because the war in Afghanistan made the most sense. It was the direct result of 9/11. It was, after 9/11, a war of necessity. We had to go in, the US had to go in and get al-Qaeda. So he basically doubled down on the war in Afghanistan, and instead of withdrawing, and as Richard Boucher says in his interview with us, instead of withdrawing and simply telling the Afghans, this is your country, you run it as best you can, President Obama decided to send to his orders, I think something like 50,000 more troops. The Bush administration, at the tail end of the Bush administration, had realized that things were not going as well in Afghanistan as they hoped. So he authorized something like 30,000 more troops. Obama, by the end of his presidency, or by the middle of his presidency, the middle of the surge, had 100,000 troops in Afghanistan. It was a full surge. And the effort was to turn the tide, to put serious boots on the ground so as to take back certain areas that the Taliban had taken, and also to win the hearts and minds of Afghans outside Kabul, I think in particular, Afghans throughout the country, and to show them that democracy was the way for Afghanistan. And one of the folks we talk with in the piece, as I mentioned before, is a former Marine Captain, Timothy Kudo, talks about the effort to win hearts and minds. And ultimately, one of the reasons he thinks that failed was because of the deaths of civilians by American troops. If you fight a significant counterinsurgency campaign in a country, civilians are going to die. And he thinks that was one of the main reasons that effort failed. And also because the Afghan government itself was by then pretty seriously corrupt, wasn't functioning the way that Washington hoped that it would function. And the Afghan army, as even US soldiers on the ground said, and I'm getting this mainly from the Afghanistan papers published in the Washington Post in 2019, they showed that US soldiers were realizing too that Afghan troops weren't as effective and were fairly corrupt. So there wasn't much trust in the government, and there wasn't going to be much trust in the government. And it was ultimately a failed effort to win. So I would say that the main turning point was around from 2006, say, to 2012, when the Taliban were resurgent and the US doubled down, and their doubling down ended not in success.
Joe, you mentioned corruption. This seems to happen a lot. Can you help American viewers understand, when you spend $2 trillion on a war, almost $2 trillion, what does the corruption actually look like? What are the mechanics of the corruption? How does it become a corrupt war?
You know, one of the things that I hear often, or heard often, from the US officials I interviewed, is that the real effort was to install democracy and standards of government accountability in Afghanistan. And that didn't work. And when you continue to throw money at the problem without having a real actionable plan for changing the culture, then the money is going to be misused. And I think that is one of the things that happened. You know, I haven't actually done the math on this myself, so I hesitate to say it, but the $2.2 trillion spent on rebuilding Afghanistan, installing a new government, a democratic government. I think, you know, you have to fact check. As you said, I'm the truth czar at Retro Report, Gleaves, or the head of fact checking at Retro Report. So I hesitate to say this, so I encourage people to verify this themselves. But I have seen reports that was more money spent than on the Marshall Plan. And that's in adjusting for the change in the value of the dollar. So it was a great deal of money spent, as you say, and it did not issue in a corruption-free Afghan government.
So are you suggesting, I don't want to turn this into I don't want to politicize the discussion, but sort of in common parlance, it was the Neocon vision to build up the institutions in Afghanistan that would be able to replicate Western markets and Western governance.
Yes.
And, you know, and the cultural supports for that. So education, for example, universities that would support Western markets and Western governance.
Right.
Would you say that were there any successes from the Neocon vision? Or was
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, in a very, the tragic evidence that anyone could point to right now is the many Afghans desperately trying to flee the country. I think that there were enough successes. I think that the education of a generation of women is a huge success, should be considered a huge success. And I think that there were, especially in Kabul, I think that there were successes in terms of education and governance that were keenly felt by the people who lived there. And as I say, I think that the many Afghans trying to flee the city right now is evidence of their desire for the continuation of that kind of government as opposed to the return of the Taliban. So yes, I think that, and I think if you were to ask someone like Richard Boucher or someone like Michael Morrell, someone like Timothy Kudo, who I talked with, that they would point to the successes that they saw on the ground over 20 years as things that they hold on to and think about right now, because of the immense tragedy that we're seeing in Afghanistan today, and that promises, I think, to continue. There were successes, but the grand strategy, so to speak, the overall strategy, the belief that the country itself could be changed and that change could take root in the place, that ultimately failed.
So are there lessons from the US officials with whom you spoke? Is there a sense that we have finally learned our lesson about this, that you can't just spend trillions of dollars on another country? You can't just send in the most sophisticated fighting machine the world has ever known and succeed. We made mistakes. We made serious mistakes. Are we learning the lesson?
Well, that is, I think, the question. It's the question that I asked everyone I talked with. I think that there's a hope that the US will learn the lessons of not just Afghanistan, but Iraq. That's something that Richard Boucher mentioned to me. Michael Morrell said in his interview that one of the things he wished presidents would do and presidential administrations would do is basically at the end a lessons learned debrief. The military did this. The DOD did this. Actually, their lessons learned program was initially classified and then leaked to the Washington Post. And in it, most of the officials interviewed, these are the generals who prosecuted the war and the diplomats who oversaw the attempt to build the Afghan government. Most of them said that for 20 years, it felt like we were there, the US was there without a very clear mission other than a vague changing of the country. And that kind of mission creep, that kind of general failure to identify specific objectives that could be achieved. That was the main thing that they thought was the failure over the 20 years, and they sincerely hope that the military learns from it for the future. But ultimately, all wars are gotten into by presidents and are declared or authorized by Congress. And I think that the real question will be whether presidents learn from this, whether Congress learns from it. One of the things that I talked with Barbara Lee, Representative Barbara Lee from California, who was the one person in 2001 who voted against the authorization to go to war in Afghanistan against al-Qaeda and its allies, the Taliban. That resolution was passed in Congress on September 14th, 3 days after the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Lee was the only person who voted against it. She voted against it because she was worried that the language of the resolution was much too broad, that it gave the president the power to go to war, not just against al-Qaeda, the perpetrators of the attack, but against any of their affiliates, any of their allies, anyone who harbored them, anyone who was in any serious way affiliated with them. And the resolution gave no time limit on this authorization. And she voted, she says herself, and she wrote at the time, and she said in her speech, and she said to us 20 years later, Retro Report that is, that she voted against it because she was worried about the threat of perpetual war, that Congress was yet again signing away its constitutional responsibility to oversee and declare war to the president. And what's I think very interesting on the one hand is that war resolution did lead to a 20-year war in Afghanistan, but also that particularly the Obama administration expanded the meaning of the resolution to cover fighting with terrorist organizations that had no real participation in 9/11. That's including ISIS, who an affiliate of theirs just sent 2 suicide bombers into Kabul, killed scores of Afghans and I think 15 US service members. That organization didn't exist in any real or significant way on 9/11, and at times they've been at odds even with the Taliban. But the Obama administration expanded the meaning of the war resolution that Lee opposed to cover war with that organization. I think one of the issues that Congress is going to have to address in the future is what I think arguably could be said to be the giving away of constitutional war powers to the executive branch.
You're right, Joe. The commander in chief, our president, certainly has constitutional authority, legal authority to prosecute a war. But let's never forget that the House of Representatives holds the purse strings,
Right.
and they can hold funding for the war
Right.
if and when they choose to make it very hard for the United States and its allies to prosecute a war,
Mhm.
if they say we're not paying for it.
Mhm.
So we need more vigorous debate in that area. Joe, remind our viewers what the title of your documentary is and where they can see it.
Oh gosh, it's on the New York Times. It is As Afghanistan Collapses, a lament for repeating the same mistakes. The main thing that I've heard from viewers and readers is that they hadn't seen the entire war covered in a succinct way that also included nuance. That was my aim, so I'm very glad that people have felt that way.
And let me just ask you, what is your next project, and does it have to do with Afghanistan and the fallout?
We were talking about veterans. I think that something that needs to be covered and addressed is the serious problem of taking care of our veterans and service members, not just from Afghanistan, but from Iraq. That is something that is so little discussed and addressed. And there's, something that Retro Report often focuses on is the legacy of major events. What is the story of a major news event 20 years later? What's the story of a major, say, a war or a disaster or a political event 20 years later? And I think that the legacy of the war in Afghanistan is obviously going to live on in Afghanistan and in the lives of Afghans. And the war's legacy is also going to live on in the United States. Many Americans could just turn their backs on the war. There's a saying, I heard this from some veterans, that soldiers go to war and Americans go to the mall. I think that it's been very possible for many Americans, including myself, to live lives not thinking about the war, in part because there is no draft, in part because we have an all-volunteer force. For that reason, I think that veterans can be often forgotten. So I think that there are stories there that I'm very interested in looking into. But other than that, I don't know yet, Gleaves. But I'm
Well,
gonna.
I really encourage you to look further into the injury, the moral injury, the veterans who have sacrificed everything on our behalf so that we can live the kinds of lives we live, going to the mall and so forth. But seriously, the soul repair that is needed, soul repair that these veterans need, is a profound problem. We never calculate the cost of these wars and how our veterans have paid for the wars in ways that never show up in our calculations. Good for you. I hope you can do that. Joe, is there anything else that you'd like to tell us about your documentary?
We've talked about the war as it was prosecuted in Afghanistan, and we've talked about mission creep, which the U.S. officials now say was, and said at the time, was a major problem in the war, and the effort to change Afghanistan as a country was a major problem in the war, and that's something that I heard time and again from the folks I interviewed. But one thing that the beginning of my documentary, or our documentary, focuses on is 9/11 and its immediate aftermath. And we were talking about Representative Barbara Lee, who was the one person who voted against the war resolution to attack and fight Al-Qaeda and its allies throughout the world, but mainly at that time in Afghanistan. As I said earlier, I was a young person, very young person, when 9/11 happened. one of the things that I think Americans are going to be doing, is I'll certainly be doing on 9/11 as we fast approach the 20th anniversary, is looking again at the images of people in New York and in Washington, D.C. On that day, and reflecting on the many ways in which the world changed on 9/11. But one of the things that Representative Lee said to us, and that I found myself thinking about, after a significantly traumatic event such as 9/11, an important thing for Americans to do, for anyone to do, is to try to stop and think about their response. And one of the things that she argues, and I think more and more people in Congress are now saying, is that it might have been better if there were a bit more debate right after 9/11 about what should be done in response. And even if there wasn't significant debate right after 9/11, over time, over the years, Americans should have likely paid, or could have likely paid, a great deal more attention to a war that soldiers were fighting abroad. And that's one thing I think I'll be thinking about as we approach September 11th, 2021, and as Afghanistan once again comes under Taliban control, um, is the legacy of the United States response to the 9/11 attacks, and how the world has changed. So that's something that I think I'll be thinking about, and I hope that it's something that people who watch the documentary will think about, because looking at the images, watching the archival footage, remembering what it felt like on that day, and remembering the sheer terror and devastation, is I think something that's important to do, even if it's difficult. I think I told you, Gleaves, that working on this documentary, I very it's very dark material and sad, but important to face.
And that leads to another question that I have, two of them actually. What, in your opinion, does this war say about the quality of American leadership?
4 presidents presided over this war. Now
It's a bipartisan question.
it is a bipartisan question. 4 presidents presided over this war. President Bush began the policy of trying to change Afghanistan. President Obama, as I said, continued that policy and tried to do it by introducing more troops. President Trump, signaled his intention to double down on the war, and then also later to end the war, attempt to end the war. President Biden is now bringing it to an end. So as you say, it's a bipartisan war. Many of the members of Congress who voted to start the war are no longer in Congress. I can't remember the actual proportion, but Congress, many members of Congress left. New members of Congress presided over the war that they weren't participants in starting, and then left. It's a truly long war. It's seen many American leaders prosecute it and oversee it. One of the things that I'll say is that it seems quite evident that no president wanted another 9/11 on their watch. And one of the arguments for staying in Afghanistan for so long is that, how could you, I mean, Jeffrey Eggers says this in our documentary, you don't want to be the president to allow another 9/11 to happen. And the potential cost of leaving Afghanistan was therefore indescribable. It couldn't be enumerated if another 9/11 were to happen from Afghanistan. But that ultimately, that line of thinking was ultimately a recipe for endless war in the country. I think that what American leaders are now saying, I think President Biden is saying this, is that the only real way to try to influence events in Afghanistan and make sure that the place doesn't yet again become a terrorist safe haven, despite the fact that the Taliban will now run it, is diplomacy. And I think that Richard Boucher also said this to me, and Barbara Lee said this to me, Representative Barbara Lee said this to me, is that I think the thinking now is that terrorism is still a serious threat, but it has to be dealt with to a larger degree, that is diplomatically rather than militarily. What that looks like I don't know, but I think I think that presidents are going to have to, and Congress is going to have to determine what that looks like.
There's so many more questions we could explore, Joe,
Yeah.
in this episode of Exploring the Question. I mean, what does the war in Afghanistan reveal about American institutions, from the military, Congress, presidency, our educational institutions that either ignored it or only concentrated on certain aspects of it? What does the war in Afghanistan say about American citizens? You mentioned national service. I mean, perhaps there needs to be a component there. We need to rethink what citizenship means in this country.
Yeah.
Clearly, this was a tragedy, a catastrophe in humanistic terms. So the human cost of this, in addition to all the economic costs, just astounding, unfathomable. We will be digging out from under this and analyzing it for years to come.
Well, that's exactly right. Excuse me. And I'll just add that, the estimates now are that something like 48,000 Afghan civilians died as a direct result of the war. I think that it's been said that that's probably a low estimate.
That's too low.
Yeah, that's too low.
That's
And one thing that cannot be forgotten either is the effect of a ground war on people there.
Think of their post-traumatic stress.
Yeah, exactly.
How do you rebuild a nation when you're laboring under that post-traumatic stress, and every backfire of a car going by makes you think it's an IUD or some kind of suicide bomb or something like that?
In a country that's always been at war, it's been at war, I shouldn't say always frivolously, it's been at war for many, many years, for decades. One of the veterans I talked with, it's not in the piece, but said that I think he was in Helmand province, and he was talking with an Afghan civilian, and the Afghan thought he was Russian. They have been so used to, the people who live in Afghanistan are so used to occupation. They're so used to fighting foreign powers. And Afghanistan has been called the graveyard of empires for a reason. I include this in the documentary, but the Bush administration did know that. They were, of course, well aware of the history of failed military campaigns in Afghanistan. President Bush talked about that to, I think it was in 2002, after the very obviously successful invasion. I think said it to a group of military cadets. He said that his administration, of course, knew of the history of failed military conflict and campaigns in Afghanistan. I think his phrase was, the history's been one of initial success followed by long years of floundering and ultimate failure. Then he said, we're not going to repeat that mistake. And viewers and Americans can now be the judge of that 20 years later, whether we did repeat that mistake. But it's a known history, and it's a history that Afghans constantly live with, and will continue to do so.
Well, those are wise words on which to end this episode of Exploring the Question. You've helped us explore a number of really vital questions to our national interest. What kind of country are we? How do we take care of allies? How do we take care of our own citizens? How do we interact with the rest of the world? Are we wise? Are we sage? Are we prudent in our interactions with the rest of the world? Joseph Hogan, thank you so much for being our guest today from the Ford Presidential Foundation. This is Gleaves Whitney, your host on Exploring the Question.